Well, it's good to be here in Edinburgh, and I should say it's good to be back in Edinburgh, because I have been here before, but it was 20 years ago. So I don't know, is there anyone here who was here 20 years ago? Okay. Good to see you. Right. Okay, well, we live in a dynamic world, and we have dynamic churches, don't we? And I bring you greetings from the British Union Conference office, which is where I currently work. And I bring greetings also from our union president, Pastor Eglin Brooks. And I'm up here as well because we have an executive committee, Scottish Mission Executive Committee, tomorrow. Now, someone mentioned earlier that I'm actually going to retire in a few months' time. So this will probably be the last time I'm here, at least in this current capacity. I'm secretary of the union at the moment. But the interesting thing is that the person who is my associate in the job, Pastor Jacques Venter, will be taking my place. And Jacques Venter has served the Scottish Mission as secretary of the Scottish Mission, and his place will be taken by Pastor Max Mackenzie Cook, who is also up this weekend as well. So all kinds of things changing. It's all very exciting. But anyway, what we're going to do today, this afternoon actually, we're going to go back in time, and we're going to look at this story that was read for us this morning by Manasseh. It was extremely well read, thank you. The story of the miraculous catch of fish. And it's there at the end of the Gospel of John. Now, some of you may know that the Gospel of John is different from the other Gospels. Now, we call the other three Gospels the synoptic Gospels because they tend to look at things in the same way, like with one eye. They see things the same way. But John is different. John was written maybe 20, 30 years after the other Gospels, and John has had time to think about what he's writing about, and he's sort of pulls everything together, and he constructs his book as a form of teaching. And he builds his book around 7 major miracles. And I won't list all 7, but for example, he talks about Jesus turning the water into wine, and he uses that as a teaching lesson to tell us that Jesus can give us the water of life. He then talks about the feeding of the 5,000 and explains that Jesus is the bread of life. He tells us about the healing of the man born blind, and he tells about how Jesus is the light of the world. And then he tells the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and he tells us of how Jesus can give us eternal life. 7 miracles. And yet the one we're talking about today isn't even one of the 7. It's like John has finished his book, he's tidied up everything he wants to say, and suddenly he just comes to him and he thinks, I've got to tell him that story. I've got to tell them that story about the miraculous catch of fish. That last time that we saw Jesus, when we were in the boat and the fish, and he's so excited, and he tells us the story of the miraculous catch of fish. And again, he uses it really as a teaching lesson to teach us that Jesus is who he says he is. Jesus did come back from the grave, and Jesus can give us eternal life. And we're going to come on to that story in just a minute. But first of all, I want us to go back in time from the time when this story was told, which remember was just after Jesus' resurrection. I want to go back in time 3 years to look at another story which also talks about Jesus and fishermen and the boat. And this story is in the book, the Gospel of Luke. And it tells us about when Jesus didn't have any disciples at all, but he was out looking for disciples. And I'm going to read you the story in Luke 5, 1 to 11. Luke 5, 1 to 11. And just remember, this is not the same story as the one in John. They're 3 years apart. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, and the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he'd finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they'd taken, and so were James and John, sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. And for the rest of our time now, I just want you to sit back and relax and listen to the story. Picture the scene in your minds. It's fairly early in the morning, and the mist is still clinging to the surface of the Sea of Galilee. Actually, Luke calls it a lake because he was used to sailing the high seas of the Mediterranean, but to the local Galilean fishermen, Galilee was big enough, so they called it a sea. Two rugged fishing boats are clinking away at the water's edge, tied up to a jetty. Some bearded fishermen, tired and short-tempered after being up all night, are spreading out their nets before the slowly rising sun, checking them for knots or breaks. The man in charge is very short-tempered indeed, and when someone calls out his name, he spins around, about to let out some sharp comments, but he checks himself just in time. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was you. What can I do for you, Jesus? The one man in the whole of Galilee that Peter had to be polite to was Jesus. You see, a little while before, Peter's wife's mum had been very seriously ill, and they'd gone to Jesus and asked if there was anything he could do to help her, and miraculously, Jesus had cured her. And Peter had said at the time, thank you so much, if there's ever anything I can do for you. But he wasn't expecting the favor to be called in first thing in the morning when he'd been up all night. Peter, would you take me out in your boat? Yes, said Peter, we'll be leaving about 7 o'clock this evening. Just feel free to come along. But his words trailed off as Jesus climbed purposefully into Peter's boat. Peter, I want you to take me out about 100 feet or so that I can speak to these people. And rather grudgingly, Peter got the rest of his crew and put out to sea. And as Jesus spoke, Peter began to listen. Jesus' words really made quite a bit of sense. This was a man that Peter admired, not because he was shouting or telling the kind of jokes that Peter was used to hearing, but because he made sense. He had power in his words, and Peter respected that. Well, Peter, maybe he dropped off, he didn't know, but before he knew it, it seemed that Jesus was sitting down again, and so Peter turned the tiller and started to make for the shore, but Jesus said, Peter, do you think we could do a bit of fishing? Well, Peter nearly exploded. Okay, so the man could talk, but healed mother-in-law or not, fishing was his business. He was the expert when it came to fishing the Sea of Galilee, and he was not going to be told what to do by a carpenter. Just for me? Jesus said. And there was something about his voice that made Peter turn again and head for the deep water. Almost as soon as they'd lowered their nets, Peter knew that something was wrong. From his years of experience, he could feel every twitch of the ropes as the fish first investigated and then became entangled in the nets. This time it wasn't just a twitch on the ropes he felt, but a positive tug, and he knew that they were in for the catch of their lives. His reactions were instinctive. His short commands to the crew and his reflex actions reflected the fact that he was a born fisherman. But even for Peter, and his expert crew. The catch was too big. It was all they could do to contain the seething mass of fish in the nets half submerged in the water, while they called their partners, James and John, over to help them. A long time later, Peter lies sprawled in the bottom of his boat, exhausted, surrounded by torn nets, wriggling fish. He looks up and he sees Jesus, and spreading his blistered hands, he said, Lord, Lord, I am a sinful man. Three years pass. Peter is again sitting in a boat, wrapped in his cloak against the cold damp of the Galilean night. So much had happened since that day when he was first called to be one of Jesus' disciples. This was the first time he'd been out fishing since that incredible day. And as the waves slapped up against the side of the boat, Peter had chance to reflect on the strange direction his life had taken. Fishers of men, they were supposed to be, and sure, he'd seen thousands of people give their lives to the Master. But where were they now? As Peter stared at his wet feet in the bottom of the boat, a member of the crew looking at Peter's face would have noticed him wince every now and then as he remembered the events of the last few weeks, of how the soldiers had come to take Jesus away, and of how he'd drawn his sword to defend him, and then of how just a few hours later he was hanging his head and swearing blind that he never even knew him. But then there were the women who told him that the tomb was empty. And then there was the time when Jesus first appeared to them after his resurrection. And then there was the time when Thomas wouldn't believe them. And they said, yes, we've seen the Master. And Thomas, what? What are you saying? Until Jesus appeared again, and Thomas actually touched the wounds in Jesus' body. But now, what were they doing now? Well, when Jesus had appeared, he hadn't given them any instructions. So maybe Peter, who was never one to sit around doing nothing, had organized this little trip as a way perhaps to raise some funds to keep them going until the Master appeared again and told them what to do. Up till now, they hadn't caught anything. And Peter might have been tempted to think that he'd lost the knack, but he was experienced enough to know that fishing's like that. Some nights you catch something, some you don't. None of the crew criticized him. They knew if there were any fish to catch them, Peter could catch them. He was an expert. He was the expert when it came to fishing the Sea of Galilee. They headed back towards the shore with no fish. But as they headed to the shore, it wasn't the fact that they had no fish that was worrying Peter, but something that had been worrying him sick ever since that night when Jesus was crucified. It was the look in Jesus' eyes when he saw him from the cross. The look which said, I heard the swearing, Peter. I heard you deny me 3 times. But I still love you, Peter. It had been eating at Peter all these weeks since then. He changed now. He knew that he would give his life for Jesus if he possibly could. He had so many things that he wanted to tell Jesus, to explain to Jesus, and to ask Jesus, but he'd never had a chance to talk to him on his own. Every time when Jesus had appeared, it had been in some locked and barred rooms with all the other disciples around. And Peter had so much that he wanted to say to him personally. And now he didn't know if he was ever going to see Jesus again. He didn't know if he was ever going to have the chance to talk to him and tell him how much he now loved him. He'd only seen Jesus twice since then. And in the cold light of the morning, perhaps his mind started to ask some questions. Was it really Jesus? How can anyone come back to life? How could he have got into those rooms when we locked and barred the door? Could it have been a ghost? Could it have been a hallucination? Perhaps Peter had heard of things like that happening. John, who was possibly sitting beside Peter in the boat, we don't know. I can imagine him looking into Peter's face and reading his mind. He could see the pain expressed in his eyes. He could feel the emotions that Peter was going through, and he wished there was something that he could do for his friend who he'd known all his life. John loved Peter. Jesus probably would have described Peter as a bit of a rough diamond, someone who had their ups and downs. You know, Peter was one of these who one moment he'd be up at the front leading the troops like a general, the next moment he'd be hanging his head in shame and despondency when things didn't go quite right. And John wished there was something he could do to help his friend. An hour or so later, they're heading back to the port. No fish. The boat's silent, except for Peter's occasional command to tighten a particular sail or make ready for a port or starboard tack. On the shore, they could make out a bit of activity. A few other craft had already landed. A few other fishermen were already spreading out their nets. One figure was standing up looking out to sea. And as they got closer, the figure shouted towards them and said, "You haven't caught anything, have you?" "Well, no," Peter shouted back, doing his best to put on a good-humoured tone of voice. "Why don't you try where you are now?" the figure said. Peter grinned, thinking that the man was joking, and then he froze where he was. His knuckles whitened on the helm, and in an instant he had hurled the pile of wet netting back into the sea. John's shout of "It's the Lord" was drowned out of Peter's hearing as he plunged headlong into the sea, thrashing wildly to get to the shore to see Jesus before the others did. Some of the other disciples probably wanted to go as well, but John, I can imagine him holding him back. No, let Peter go. Peter needs to talk to Jesus on his own. When they finally got to the shore, the disciples had learnt their lesson from the previous encounter, the last time they'd been out fishing, and this time they towed the fish up to the shore without risking sinking the boats. And when they got there, they found that Peter and Jesus had already prepared some fish. There was a barbecue, and they were cooking them. And they sat down to eat. And there was bread, and it was broken, and it was passed around. And someone said grace, and it was just like the old times. But maybe there were one or two of them there looking at Jesus to see if he was actually going to eat anything. You know, they too had heard the rumors. They too had had the doubts. Could it have been a ghost? Was he actually real? And maybe some of them would have expected Jesus like the ghost of Jacob Marley in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you know, to be rather transparent and certainly unable to eat real food. But as they looked, Jesus tucked into the food just like the rest of them, just like the old times. The story goes on. It's a wonderful way to end the Gospel of John. How Jesus took the time to rebuild the confidence that Peter had lost and made Peter one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. I've got a couple of pictures I'd like to show you. I don't know if this was going to work. Let's see if we can get the PowerPoint on the screen. Okay. Don't think my beeper is working. Do I have to point it in a particular direction? There we go. a few years ago, Moira, my wife, and I went on holiday to the Holy Land. We wanted to see some of the sites, and we had a fantastic time. It was my second time there. It was Moira's first time. And we went to Jerusalem, saw all kinds of things in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, these wonderful places. And then we, that's backwards, that's why it's not working. There we go. And then we went up to Galilee. So we had the first half of the holiday down in Jerusalem, then we drove up to Galilee. And on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee is a little village called Tabgha. And Tabgha is traditionally the site where this miracle took place. And we really wanted to see this because we were so familiar, obviously, with the story in John. And so we drove up, we had a little hire car, and we drove here to the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter. And it's an absolutely beautiful place. It was quiet, serene, the weather was fantastic, an atmosphere of holiness about it. You've got to hand it to the Catholic Church. They look after their sites really well. So thank you to them for that. And as we got down towards the beach, we saw this sign, "Silence, please." And then we found a couple of indications of what had happened there. A bench there with some fish carved on it. And then we found this church, and this is actually the church that was mentioned, the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, it's called. Now this church, there are records of this church being in existence from the 4th century AD. So it is pretty likely that the church did exist in that time. It was destroyed later on, about 1,000 years later, but it was rebuilt in 1933 by the Franciscans, and they did a fantastic job. It's a beautiful, simple church. And at the front of the church, on what serves as an altar, is actually a large piece of limestone rock. And the rock extends from the church through the side wall and out not down to the beach, but sticking out of the side wall. I'll show you it in a minute. And it's called Mensa Christi, which means the table of Christ. And I'll just show you a bit more of the church. There's Moira sitting in the church. The doors, beautiful carved doors. There's the stone altar, worn smooth by the millions of pilgrims that have visited this site. Just heading out through the doors, we'll go round to the side, and I'll show you this rock. There you can see the rock through the glass window as it comes out the side of the church. And there it is. The lower part, actually, you can see the two layers of brick. The lower blocks, are believed to be from the original church that was there from around the 4th century, so the 300s, on to around the year 1000 or so. And it's believed, the tradition is, that it's this very rock where Jesus and Peter had that first barbecue, where they cooked the fishes. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but as Moira and I walked around that site, as we walked down to the beach, and as we paddled in the Sea of Galilee, and as a little fish came and nibbled our toes, there was a real feeling, a real sense of this being a site of significance, a site of great importance, a site where very important things had happened in the past. Interestingly, there are a number of stones laid down going down the beach, and we looked at them first of all, thought they were stepping stones, but they're all carved into the shape of a heart, which is interesting. And when I looked this up, I found out that these stones date from the 8th century BC, so these are well over 1,000 years old. And they're called the 12 thrones, but they're carved into the shape of a heart. Does anyone know why? Anyone know in the story of there in that last John chapter 21, what was it that Jesus asked of Peter at the end of their encounter there on the beach? He said, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times, the same number of times that Peter denied Jesus. "Peter, do you love me?" Wonderful, wonderful thought. There's the church on the beach with the stone, and then over there are the stepping stones as I thought they were. So it's a wonderful story with, I believe it's a true story. Most Christians believe this is a true story. And when you experience it, when you realize that these things actually happen, what does it tell us? Well, I think there's a number of things the story tells us. There's a number of lessons for us today. First thing is, I would say, it's a real story of real people with real doubts and real problems, just like we are today. If you'd been there, who would you be? Are you a Peter? Have we got any Peters here? You don't need to raise your hand. You can answer this to yourself. Peter, ready to lead? Are you a John, a quiet thinker, able to read the minds of other people? Or are you a Thomas, who's a bit skeptical, but deep down, really solid guy? Or Nathaniel, or one of the other disciples? Are you one of those who just does the hard work of pulling the net ashore? I suppose the point is that they were all